Picture yourself standing on cold, wind-battered limestone, staring at a fire-scarred floor where someone knelt over 11,000 years ago, grinding wild grains and feeding a hearth day after day, long before pottery existed, long before anyone planted seeds on purpose, long before the world resembled anything we know today. Archaeologists working in southeastern Turkey believe they have found spaces that served exactly that kind of daily purpose. But here's where the story twists, because the word kitchen might be the least reliable part of the entire headline. Welcome to Karahan Tepe, a site that raises an uncomfortable question most documentaries avoid. What if the people we casually label Stone Age hunter-gatherers were already living with routine, planning, and building projects that feel almost impossible for their era? Today, we are going to do something most clickbait will not. We are going to separate what is actually confirmed in the ground from what has been packaged for the internet. And by the end, you will understand why the most important discovery here may not be a kitchen at all, but a society caught in the act of transformation. So where is this place, and why should you care? Karahan Tepe sits on a wind-swept limestone ridge in the Tek Mountains, roughly 55 kilometers east of Sanliurfa, and it belongs to Taz Tepler, meaning Stone Hills, a cluster of around 20 Neolithic sites quietly rewriting early human history. The dates matter. We are talking pre-pottery Neolithic, roughly 10,000 to 8,500 BC, with the main activity falling between 11,500 and 10,200 years ago. That is more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge, more than 6,000 years before the pyramids. And that gap should stop you in your tracks, because it means these people were achieving something extraordinary at a moment when textbooks tell us small mobile bands were merely scraping by. Systematic excavations kicked off in 2019 under Professor Nick Carroll from Istanbul University. And what his team uncovered does not look like a random camp. It looks planned. At least 4 communal enclosures, labeled AA through AD, have emerged, circular and oval spaces carved directly into bedrock, some stretching as wide as 23 meters, containing iconic T-shaped pillars, carved benches, and wall niches that still resist easy explanation. But here's the open loop. On the southern plain, the team also found more than 30 domestic dwellings, plus quarries and hunting traps. So you're looking at a landscape that holds the monumental and the everyday side by side. And that combination alone suggests a community that was not just passing through, but living, organizing, and returning season after season. Now let's tackle the headline everyone came for, the so-called 12,000-year-old kitchen. Handle this with care. Kitchen is largely a media label, useful shorthand that appeared in outlets and social clips, but not a term peer-reviewed papers used to describe the find. And 12,000 years is best understood as a rounded approximation for the early Neolithic window, not a date chiseled in stone. So if it is not officially a kitchen, what did archaeologists actually uncover that made journalists reach for that word? Here's what is confirmed. Hearths, flat grinding stones, mortars and pestles, hand stones, stone platforms, storage alcoves, troughs, basins, and vessels. And then one detail that changes everything. In a November 2025 interview, Professor Carroll described a circular communal building that includes benches and, in his own words, 2 large ovens for preparing food at certain times. That is his phrasing, not a headline writer's invention. And when describing the dwellings, he added, inside we find standing stones, hearths, flat stone floors, and sections likely used for storage or for placing grinding tools. So the physical footprint of daily life is real fire, grinding, storage, repeated activity. But what can we responsibly say it means? The grinding equipment, the salt and limestone querns along with mortars and pestles, strongly suggest processing of wild plant foods, probably cereals like wheat and barley and legumes such as lentils and chickpeas. Hearths and those communal ovens point to roasting and heating. Storage alcoves and vessels hint that people were holding on to resources rather than consuming everything on the spot. Animal bones and hunting traps reinforce the image of hunter-gatherers capable of coordinated hunting and planning. Yet responsible archaeology is about what you can prove, not just what you can picture. And right now, crucial gaps demand respect. There are no published phytolith or starch residue studies confirming exactly which plants touch those grinding stones. There are no published lipid residue, results revealing what the vessels once held. Radiocarbon dating suggesting site onset around 9400 BC exists, but the publication record remains thin, and there is no confirmed evidence for boiling or fermentation, which would be nearly impossible anyway without pottery. So anytime you hear someone speak with total certainty about what was cooking here, that confidence is running ahead of the data. Still, one question lingers, and it is worth pausing on. Was food preparation mostly private, household by household, or was it also communal, something that pulled people together at particular moments? The site appears to show both. Individual dwellings with their own hearths and grinding tools suggest household-scale routine, but the larger enclosures, especially the mention of big ovens inside a communal building, suggest moments when preparation scaled up, possibly for gatherings that were social, ritual, or both. In other words, Karahan Teep might reveal not just what people ate, but how they built community around food. And that brings us to the inevitable comparison. Göbekli Tepe, roughly 35 kilometers northwest, famous worldwide, and often called the oldest temple on Earth, though that label is debated. A more cautious description is a monumental ritual or communal complex. Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe are broadly contemporaneous and share striking DNA. T-shaped pillars carved with arms and hands, circular bedrock-cut enclosures, relief carvings of snakes, animals, and humans, and even a practice of deliberately burying structures under sterile soil. But Karahan Tepe also carries its own signature: more human sculptures, prominent phallic imagery, clearly defined dwellings and quarries, and over 266 T-pillars counted so far. So what about the big claim? The world's earliest monumental architecture? Say it precisely. The Taz Tepler cluster, including both sites, represents the oldest known monumental stone construction by non-agricultural peoples, far older than the famous monuments of later civilizations. Yet other PPNA sites like Jerf El Amar in Syria also have communal architecture and deserve comparison. And Professor Carroll himself has cautioned that it is difficult to call these structures temples until we know what they were for. They may have been multi-purpose spaces for councils, feasts, rituals, and activities we have not yet learned to read. So what would it take to move from compelling story to confirmed interpretation? For things, more radiocarbon dates from well-stratified context to sharpen the timeline, microbotanical analysis on grinding tools to identify specific plant species, lipid residue studies on vessels and basins to test what they once held, and detailed spatial mapping of hearths, tools, and bone deposits to see whether food work was scattered across households or organized around communal events. Excavations are ongoing, meaning the next lab result could either reinforce the kitchen narrative or replace it with something even more surprising. Because the real takeaway is not a catchy label. It is this. Over 11,000 years ago, before farming took hold, people here built monumental stone spaces, maintained homes, processed food with specialized tools, and gathered sometimes privately, sometimes communally in ways that look like the earliest architecture of society itself. If this evidence-first journey into Karahan Tepe held your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. New excavations and analyses are coming, and the best version of this story is still ahead of us. And the next time you sit down to share a meal, remember, the impulse to turn raw nature into shared food might be older than civilization, but it has never been more human.